this evening's program. And frankly, a lot of people that are from, I saw one registrant from upstate New York and some from across Pennsylvania, and some of the other areas in the region as well. So we welcome, your participation. As you know, this year we are doing all of our programs via Zoom, since we cannot meet in person. And we suspect that that's going to be the case right up through our spring schedule of monthly meetings. I do want to give some attention. Our next meeting that was scheduled was going to be our annual meeting at dinner, which is not going to take place. But our speaker is Amy Weidensaw, and she is going to be speaking about her research, her doctoral dissertation that has to do with youth education and as a pathway to young people becoming involved with birds and ornithology. So we are really pleased that Amy Weidensaw will be our December 6th speaker at 7:30 in the evening. We'll be promoting that again via tomorrow, or go to the Wingcoat Audubon website, wingcoataudubon.org, and you can register there. It's another Eventbrite presentation. Many of you know Amy Weidensaw from her work with Audubon Maryland and with Audubon Pennsylvania. And of course, now she is in Massachusetts, working for the Massachusetts Audubon Society, running their largest sanctuary and center. So we'll be pleased to get a sense of her report and research that includes, I think, an interview with tonight's presenter as well. I think he was part of the presentation. But at this point, what I'd like to do is turn this over to Kevin Roth. Kevin is the educator at the Pennypack Ecological Restoration Trust. I know he has a longer title than that, but he is the main guy when it comes to programming over there. And we're very fortunate to have him on the Wingcoat Audubon board, serving as our program chair. He's been great, especially with the challenges of COVID-19, to help us be able to do these presentations this evening and for the other months ahead. He's put together an excellent lineup of programs. And I will say, as I looked at the chat box, somebody on from Washington State, somebody on from Minnesota. And so as people continue to log on, it looks like we have folks from quite a few locations around the country, not all just Wingcoat Audubon. Here's somebody from Canada that just signed in Western New York. So really pleased to have this kind of interest. I don't want to hold up those of you that have already registered. I know there were quite a few that did, but I want to turn it over to Kevin Roth, who will say a few words and introduce this evening's speaker, so that we can move forward with tonight's program. So thank you, everybody. I think at this point, we'll turn it over to Kevin Roth.
Perfect. Thank you, Lee, and happy Friday night, everybody. Thank you for joining the Wingcoat Audubon Society on our monthly program. It's actually kind of turned out really nice that we could have this many people from across the country join us for this program and all of our programs. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you all for joining us this Friday night. We have a great presentation tonight, and I'm excited to introduce our speaker. Joe and Lee and I were talking before you all signed on, and I could probably talk for a good hour or two just about Mr. Wunderly's bio here. But after discussing with him, we decided it's only going to be a couple, maybe a minute. So here I go to introduce our speaker here tonight. His name is Joseph Wunderly, and he's actually joining us from Georgia, Athens, Georgia. So a bit away from Philadelphia and Wingcoat Audubon Society, but we're happy to have him here tonight, all the way from Georgia. He just got done 30 years of service with the Forest Service, and he's currently with the University of Puerto Rico, working with them on various studies, I imagine. He is also the co-author to the Field Guide to Natural History of the Bahamas. So we're here tonight to learn about the effects of hurricanes on the Caribbean birds, So I imagine someone who is a co-author of that book has a great deal of knowledge on this subject. So we're very lucky to have him on with us tonight. And like I said, I could talk for another hour about him, but you're going to see all of his experience tonight in this presentation. His presentation should be about 45 minutes long, with about 15 minutes for questions at the end. With that being said, if you have any questions during the presentation and you don't want to forget about them, simply go to the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen here, and you can click chat and you can message to the whole group your questions. So don't hold on to your questions, just get those to the chat box. And at the very end of his presentation, we'll open the chat up and we'll have direct access to ask Joe questions. I do like what everyone's doing here in the chat box right now. If everybody that's on could just let us know what state or what town they're in Pennsylvania, I think that'd be a pretty cool exercise as we all join in here. I'm still admitting a couple people to the program. And just a couple other housekeeping issues, or not issues, Zoom practices, best Zoom practices, I should say, is that everybody tonight is going to be on mute except for the presenters, and everybody's video should also be turned off to keep the distractions down. So with as long as you guys are on Zoom and you are muted and you know where the chat box is, I will be monitoring that the entire program. And without further ado, here's your program about the effects of hurricanes on Caribbean birds, presented by the Joseph Wunderly. Thank you, Joseph.
Kevin, you are going to record the program, I believe.
Yes, it is being recorded as we speak. So if anyone missed this, we'll have it ready for anyone that wants it after the program. So again, here is your presenter, Joe Wunderly.
Well, thank you, Kevin, for that nice introduction. And before I start, I'd like to thank Windcoat Audubon, because it was the Windcoat Bird Club back in the 60s.
Yeah, I'm trying to get the sound.
Do you have my sound? Can you hear me?
Yes, Joe, you're good to go. Someone else was having troubles. You keep going.
It was the Windcoat Bird Club that was instrumental in launching a lot of my interests in ornithology. Back in the 60s, I was a member when I was in junior high school. I actually became the librarian of the Windcoat Bird Club, and ultimately in 1968, I received the Griscom Fellowship to the Audubon Camp in Maine, which was instrumental in getting me interested in ecology. So the Windcoat Bird Club was very important, including the Christmas bird counts. And I have continued in the spirit of the Christmas bird counts in Puerto Rico, where I've run Christmas bird counts there now for 26 years. This will be a challenge. This year we are going to try and run something, but I credit the Windcoat Audubon for helping me get started. So thank you, Windcoat, and I hope you enjoy this this presentation. Now, I got into the hurricane business the way most biologists do. I didn't deliberately go after hurricanes, but they did seem to find me, or at least they seemed to find where I had worked. That is, I had baseline. That is, I was doing previous studies when these things roared in. And of course, after you recover from this, you've got to go back out and see what it did to your bird populations and their habitats. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about a number of different studies, not all of them my own, but I will point those out. And you'll note that hurricanes are a timely topic now. This year, for example, there were 30 named storms, that is tropical cyclones and hurricanes. 13 of them were hurricanes, and the most recent one, Hurricane Iota, which hit Nicaragua and Honduras at the border there, was briefly a class 5 before it struck Central America. So these are events that are certainly ongoing right now. Now, I'm going to start with some pictures just to sort of get you into the mood, as it were. These are before and after pictures from several different hurricanes, primarily from Puerto Rico, but I'll show you some others. Closed canopy forest, our forests normally look like this, but a couple of days after hurricane, they look like this. or they look like this. This is Lococo Falls in the Luquillo Mountains, the El Yunque National Forest, eastern Puerto Rico. This is what it normally looks like, lots of tourists. And then, of course, afterwards, of course, no tourists, they were blown away. But take a look at that forest, pretty shocking. And it's just as if this happens overnight. If you can imagine your local birding spots, the Pennypack, the Wissahickon, Bowman's Hill, Valley Forge, imagine going from summer immediately into winter, because that's what, in essence, is what's happening. One day it's covered with foliage like this. The next day the foliage is gone. And of course, a few trees are down too, and broken branches, but it's shocking. And every time I go through it, I still get shocked. This is a picture of the road and the forest along the road that goes to my office, or what was my office in Puerto Rico before I retired. And this is what it looked like after Irma and Maria. So considerable difference there. And of course, you look at this and you ask yourself, my God, how can anything survive this? And the amazing thing is, a lot of birds, a lot of animals manage to come through this. Well, as you're well aware, the Caribbean basin has a high frequency of hurricanes and tropical storms. This is a map from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration showing the tracks of tropical cyclones. Now, tropical cyclones are either tropical storms, that is, storms that have a maximum wind up to 40 miles per hour, actually 40 to 70 miles per hour. Over 70, it's a hurricane. So these are the tracks of tropical storms and hurricanes. And you'll notice, no surprise, high incidence here in the Caribbean, as well as the Gulf Coast and southeastern US. How common are these? Well, in the Texas Gulf Coast, you can figure that these storms have a return rate within roughly 50 nautical miles of about 25 to 36 years. South Florida, you can assume about 14 to 19 years. And you get out there to North Carolina, on the Outer Banks, such as Hatteras, we're talking 16 to 25 years. The island of Puerto Rico has a return rate of roughly 15 years, although actually it's a shorter rate now. I haven't recalculated it, but for about 15 years for Puerto Rico. Any one location on the island, at least the eastern end of the island, about every 60 years. So these are quite frequent events, and they are frequent enough that they play a major role in structuring the biota, that is, the plants and animals of these islands. And no surprise, these animals appear to be relatively well adapted. These are some of our species. The Caribbean is a biodiversity hotspot. There are over 700 species of birds known from the region. 171 are endemic, and 54 are globally threatened. But my point of putting this up is there are a lot of birds that live there, that are residents, that evolved in that region, and are still surviving, although, as you'll note here, 54 are globally threatened. Now, we have a lot of wintering migrants as well as passage birds coming through the Caribbean. These are also potentially affected by hurricanes, and I'll mention some of those in my talk. Now, to get to the talk specifically, and this is view this as my table of contents, we can view hurricanes as having direct and indirect effects. And I think most of you are familiar with the direct effects of birds. The obvious ones, of course, are mortality from exposure to winds, rain, and flooding. And we tend to see cases of mortality, particularly of aquatic species. One is a larger body size, they're easier to find, but these are pictures from recent hurricanes, dead cattle egret. Here's a whole group of flamingos. This is a picture from Cuba from a recent hurricane in 2017, and here's a tropic bird that was washed up after a hurricane on the coast in Puerto Rico. The other direct effect is geographic displacement by winds. And serious birders, of course, all know that you want to go out and bird after a hurricane on the East Coast because there are all sorts of cool things that are blown up that way. Frigate birds are commonly moved north with these storms, as are noddies, sooty terns. All of those are commonly moved by birds. But this is not the focus of my talk because I think you're pretty well familiar with this. My focus is primarily on the indirect effects on birds. These are the ones that have the longest lasting impacts. And they include the loss of the food supplies and foraging substrate, changes in the habitat structure and composition, changes in vulnerability to predators, competitors, or parasites, and the loss of nests or roost sites. All of these can be indirect effects. Now, I'm going to talk about my first hurricane experience, and this was on the island of Jamaica. We had sampled the island of Jamaica in December of 1987, basically doing censuses to sample both the migrant and the resident birds of the island. We sampled 5 different locations, 10 different habitats. We had a thorough study, and it turns out it was a perfect study for hurricane baseline because Hurricane Gilbert roared through on the 10th of September. It spent almost 3 days over the poor island of Jamaica. Tremendous damage. It was a class 3 hurricane, went down the backbone of the island. As you can see here, this is the direct path. The eye wall is estimated with these lines here. So this is the part of Jamaica that received the major brunt of this storm. The storm caused $2 billion in damages, killed at least 49 people. So it was a very devastating storm for the inhabitants of this island. Now, as I said, we had sampled previously, and this gave us something to compare. That is a baseline that we could go back and compare. So we were able to go back 4 months after this hurricane, and we were able to get into our study sites, occasionally with help of some locals with machetes, but we were able to get in there and sample birds. And this is what the island looked like after the hurricane. I apologize for the quality of these photos. These were taken back in the days when we used slides. These were not done digitally. They were scanned, and they're not particularly good pictures, but nonetheless, I want to convince you that Jamaica had been nailed by a hurricane. These are high elevation habitats that we sampled, roughly around 1,300 meters, a little above. We sampled sun coffee, and you can see here, most of these are coffee trees here, or bushes. Those were badly damaged by the storm. The cloud forest was largely leafless, and there were a lot of standing stems, but of course some had fallen down. But nonetheless, many of the trees were standing, but there was no evidence of recovery or leaf out. And pine plantations were devastated. These look like matchsticks here, and those are the stems, the trunks of the pine trees. Now, pine is not native to Jamaica, so these were introduced pine, Pinus caribe, and they just fell right over. Mid elevation habitats were hit hard, such as shown here in the wet limestone forest of Jamaica. You can see, barely, here in the center, my colleague Bob Wade, who assisted me with this work, and my wife is hidden in there somewhere. I don't see her, but she's also in there, and they're measuring a vegetation plot that we had put in before the hurricane. And what they're going through here is, this is the canopy, except the canopy is at ground level. And this is an important part of the story because canopy birds follow the canopy down to ground level. Now, let's look at our results from that first hurricane study. And we expected to find tremendous devastation and loss of birds, but our results were quite surprising to us. Before the hurricane, we had a total of 58 species, as you can see in this black bar here. And after the hurricane, we had a total of 58 species. 50 species were found before and after. That is, 50 species were common to both before and after samples. So very similar to what we had before. 8 species were found before only, and 8 species found after. These 8 species found before only were species that were quite rare, difficult to find, and it's reasonable to expect that we miss them on our second visit. And these species after also were rare species, and some of these species were exciting species like the European starling or the house sparrow. Or even the rock dove or rock pigeon. Not necessarily endemics like the streamer-tailed hummingbird as shown here. So it doesn't look as though there was turnover, serious turnover in the species. Let's take a look at numbers of individuals. And what we found, as I show in this histogram, is that the bird population declines were most frequent at high elevation, that is the mountains, and relatively uncommon in the lowlands. Here I show a tally of the number of populations in the high elevation habitats that showed decreases after the passage of the storm, in contrast to the number of populations that showed an increase or no change. So here you can see many more decreases than those that showed an increase or no change. In contrast to the lowlands, that is below 900 meters, you see that relatively similar numbers of decreasing and increasing species. In fact, slightly more decrease or no change at all. And we'll look at why things might increase in a minute. But what we believe drives a lot of this difference, now this is 4 months after the passage of the storm, is that at the high elevation, we saw no evidence of recovery of the vegetation. That is, no new leaves, no growth of vines, nothing seemed to be growing at all. Whereas down in the lowlands, as shown by this picture, we found the growth of vines. This is a fallen tree that came down in Gilbert, and this is a vine that's growing over it. So this had occurred within the 4 months after that storm. You also see all the new leaves on these trees here. These are just skeletons of trunks where the leaves just sort of popped out of the trunks, which is actually quite common in lowland areas of the tropics after these storms. Very quick recovery. Whereas up here, almost no recovery. Not surprising. Plants at high elevation have slow growth rates, so they recover more slowly. And this, of course, would affect the bird populations. So this is how we would explain this pattern here. So these are the birds up here that are probably most at risk. Well, let's look at these montane species in a little more detail. Who were they? Well, let's take a look at their diets. We can do this based on previous studies on the diets of the birds of Jamaica, and we can classify them into different diet categories. The birds that feed on nectar, that is the nectivores, or birds that feed on fruit and seeds, frugivore seed eaters, or the insectivores, which we broke into 2 different groups, the resident, that is the Jamaican insectivores that live there all year round, and the migrant insectivores. These are those neotropical migrants that breed up in the States and come down to the Caribbean for the winter. So we separated the insectivores out. Well, as we can see here, there were many more decreases of nectivores than increases or no change. And notably, more decreases in populations of the frugivore seed eaters versus those that increased or no change. But if you look at the insectivores, both groups, almost no change. That is, the numbers of decreases basically comparable to the number of increases and no change. So basically, those birds that rely directly on plants for food, that is, take nectar from flowers or the fruits and seeds, those are the birds that are most likely to suffer. Whereas the insectivores, that does not seem to be the case. Interesting comparison here. These are the birds that were on the island when Gilbert went through. Gilbert was a September storm. Most of our migrants don't arrive until October. So most of our migrant insectivores were not even present in Jamaica when the storm went through. And yet, look how similar the response of those birds are. So these are the birds that went through the storm. These are the birds that missed it. Nonetheless, look at the changes in their populations. Now, what this says to us is that for hurricanes, for terrestrial, that is land birds, the greatest effect is in the aftermath rather than during the storm. It seems that a lot of these birds can actually survive these storms. How do they do it? Well, our observations suggest a lot of them just get down on the ground and hunker down and don't try and fly. There is, of course, some direct mortality, but the real bottleneck is afterwards when there's no food. And these are some of the species which declined afterwards. And these are some of the Jamaican species, showing the species and the locations where they showed declines. The orange quit, related to the tanagers, it's highly frugivorous, also takes some nectar, declined in 2 habitats, high elevation, montane sites. Black-faced grass quit, declined actually in the dry scrub. They feed a lot on seeds. This is an area that probably lost a lot of their seeds. Yellow-faced grassquit, another endemic from Jamaica, showed declines primarily in 3 montane habitats, as expected. The streamer-tailed hummingbird, which is the national emblem of Jamaica, declined massively in 3 different habitats in high elevation: the cloud forest, sun coffee, and in the pine plantations. So they really took a beating. Here is one of our neotropical migrants, a bird many of you know well from North America in the spring, summer, and fall, and it declined in montane pine plantations and lowland shade. Now, this is an insectivorous species. Now, why did it decline? Well, if you think about how this bird feeds, it feeds out on the ends of branches and out on twigs. And what happened is the bird lost the substrate. In other words, they disappeared from those pine plantations. And if you recall the picture that I showed you of all the pine trees that fell down, the bird had no substrate upon which to forage to obtain those insects. The lowland shade coffee, what happened is those shade trees, coffee in the lowlands, much of the tropics, is grown under a canopy of shade. Well, the storm took that canopy off. And when that canopy disappeared, the foraging substrate for the black and white warbler disappeared. So despite the fact that it feeds on insects, which are quite resistant and resilient to these storms, nonetheless, since it lost its foraging substrate, it declined. Now, it may have moved to other areas. One of the things we do know, no surprise, those high winds that strip the leaves off of trees and break branches also remove flowers and fruits. And this is a graphic example. I was going to show you a graph and show you numbers, but I don't think I need to show you numbers. These are photos here of Sierra palm, mid-elevation in the Luquillo Mountains of Puerto Rico. Here we see the green fruits here, which is normally what it looks like when these storms come through in September and October. This is what they look like when they're ripe. This is what it looks like after the storm goes through. No fruit at all, just none. This is what the tree normally looks like. They often grow in pure stands of Sierra palm. This is what it looks like afterwards. You can see virtually all the palm fronds are lost, or at least hanging down on the tree. They look, they look god awful, and you think, oh my goodness, they're dead. Relatively little mortality in those palms, however. The following year, they were back looking just like this plant here. So they're very quick to recover, which is fortunate for birds because they feed on these fruits, including the Puerto Rican parrot, which I'll mention shortly. Nectivores suffer, and this is a sad example. This was taken after Hurricane Irma on the island of St. Martin. This is an Antillean crested hummingbird foraging on the ground. It's probing not a flower, but a colored piece of paper on the ground attempting, it looks to us as though they were trying to get nectar. There were no flowers. There really were no options for these birds. So you can see why nectivores suffer after these storms. Well, why are avian insectivore declines so rare? Well, the life cycle of insects is very fast, very short. Many of the insects survive the storm in the egg, larvae, or pupa stage. And even if they lose the adult stage, they quickly cycle into another stage and are able to recover. And in fact, we often see surprising outbreaks of insects after these storms. These outbreaks are generally rare in the tropics when you don't have hurricanes because there's enough predator or parasite or parasitoid pressure to keep their numbers down. But after a hurricane, which knocks down their predators, some of these animals, some of these insects explode. And you see this in the foliovores, that is the herbivores that feed on leaves. Here's some beetles devouring some fresh leaves here. Here you can see the umbrella tree with holes from insects. And here's another species which has been heavily defoliated. And these are outbreaks, as I said, that are particularly common after hurricanes. Normally, we don't see them in the forest. They're actually quite rare. The other group of insects that increases are those that feed on dead plant material. Well, of course, after a hurricane, they're in Fat City. So the detritivores, as they're called, increase massively after these storms. So you can see why insectivores, such as this gray kingbird, why their populations do just fine. There's plenty of food for them. Well, these are some species which increased after Hurricane Gilbert. And it's a mixture of species and a mixture of habitats, but virtually all of them in the lowlands. And these are a mix of endemics. The dusky cap flycatcher showed increases in several habitats here. The Jamaican oriole, another endemic, increased in dry limestone scrub. The Jamaican spindalis, related to the tanagers, increased in 2 lowland habitats. The Jamaican white-eyed vireo increased in the lowlands. The euphonia, related to the tanagers, increased in the lowland second forest. And in the mangroves, we saw increases in yellow warblers. Now, why did we see these increases? Well, it is not a reproductive response because these birds usually don't breed until starting in about March and April, very similar to the breeding season actually in the temperate zone around Philadelphia. And so these increases cannot be attributed or unlikely to be attributed to a reproductive response, but more likely to a movement response. And one of the things we've found is that there are species that show decreases in some sites after hurricanes and increases in other sites. And these are 3 species that showed statistical decreases in one habitat and statistical increases in another habitat. The bananaquit, common nectivore, white-chinned thrush, related to our robin, a tortoise. This is an endemic, showed decreases in some sites, increases in other. And the prairie warbler, which many of you know is a neotropical migrant, common in the States, Pennsylvania, Jersey. They also showed decreases in some habitats and others. Well, some of these patterns suggest altitudinal migration. Here's evidence from bananaquits that show decreases in montane, that is high elevation habitats, and increases in lowland habitats. And this is consistent with an elevational migration. That is, they get out of those forests that are slow to recover at high elevation and move into the lowlands where things recover relatively quickly. The other group of birds that seem to show increases are canopy dwellers. And you'll remember my picture there with my friend and my poor wife in there taking vegetation measurements. And this is a picture of the canopy. Well, guess what? The canopy birds are no longer able to forage in the canopy, so they drop into ground level. And if you put up mist nets, as we did, that is those very fine nets that we use to capture birds and ban them, and then, of course, release them, you find that your capture rates after these storms are unbelievably high, at least shortly after the storm. And here's some results from our work in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Hugo, where we had mist nets in places where we had netted prior to the hurricane. We were able to start our netting 2 weeks after the passage of Hugo, and we were simply blown away, as it were, by the high capture rates of birds. And we had more capture rates than ever before. Well, when we divided the birds into two categories, those that live primarily in the canopy, such as the Puerto Rican tody, shown here, versus the understory dwellers, such as some hummingbirds, we found that the increases were greatest in these canopy dwellers after the storm versus before. Whereas in the understory, we found absolutely no change in the captures or the capture rate after these storms. So this, of course, makes sense because there is no canopy up there. Where are they going to forage? And they just simply come down to ground level. And if you're walking in these forests after these hurricanes, one of the things that impresses you is the number of canopy dwelling species that you see quite easily. Whereas prior to the hurricane, they were difficult to see because they were up there in all that foliage. Not anymore, they're down at ground level. Now, eventually what happens is these canopy dwellers move off, and of course the foliage comes back, and then of course they go back up. But nonetheless, these are some temporary shifts that we commonly see. Well, of course, people always like to know, well, what happened to the Puerto Rican parrot? Now, the Puerto Rican parrot at one time was the most endangered species in the world. That is back in the 1970s, early 70s, around 1972, 73. There were about 13 Puerto Rican parrots in the wild in Puerto Rico, here in the Luquillo Mountains of eastern Puerto Rico. Now, there were some more birds which had been captured and held in an aviary to try and breed them in captivity, but nonetheless a very endangered species. They've been able to build those populations up, and they have now established a second population over here in Rio Bajo, which is a commonwealth or state forest. The Luquillo Mountains are part of the national forest, the Yunque National Forest, and these are the two locations where the parrots are found. But unfortunately, with Maria, which came through in 2017, the 20th of September, it approached the island as a class 5, slowed down to a class 4 storm, and then headed across the island with tremendous devastation. And you undoubtedly have saw the news reports and have heard about the difficulties for the islanders, and they indeed have been horrendous. And they're still suffering some of those consequences. Well, what happened to these parrots? Well, in the Luquillo Mountains, prior to the arrival of this hurricane, there were about 53 to 56 birds in the wild. After the storm, this is by the next year, there were only two parrots that were left. And these were two birds that had returned to the aviary and were found at the aviary. So that was a 96% decline of the Luquillo population. In contrast, in Rio Bajo, this location here, there were about 130 to 136 birds before the hurricane. Afterwards, 70 to 80 birds were found. So a decline only of 45%. And I say only, that's in comparison to this catastrophe here. Well, what happened? Well, certainly this area was hit by the hurricane and there was ample damage. But one of the differences in this Rio Bajo site is that they fed the parrots. They established that population at an aviary where they raised the birds first in the aviary and then released them outside the aviary and fed them artificially. And the birds moved off and reproduced naturally and started feeding on natural foods. But now and then they could come back to the aviary and get a bite to eat if they wanted to. So they knew where the food was after the hurricane. In contrast, in the Luquillo population, that is up in the mountains, the birds were not released in association with the aviary. That is, they didn't know where the food was. And the entire mountainside, the whole mountain was defoliated. Their fruits were lost. And we do know that a number certainly survived the storm. In fact, one of our technicians, who is a very good observer, counted 11 parrots several weeks after the passage of Iris, or excuse me, of Maria. And we know that they did, in fact, survive. But eventually, they succumbed and disappeared. So having a food source for these birds in that bottleneck period when there's no food is very important. I should point out that the managers of the parrot, the Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife Service and the Puerto Rican Department of Natural Resources now have a program where in their releases back here in the Luquillo Mountains, they're providing them with food, and these birds will know where the food is the next time food comes by. Well, what can we do? Well, I just pointed out the importance of food during the bottleneck period. And I gave you the example of those parrots in Rio Bajo. These are some pictures as part of Operation Feeder Rescue, which I'll explain in a minute. And this was after Hurricanes Irma and Maria throughout the Eastern Caribbean. And turns out when people put out nectar feeders, they were swarmed with bananaquits. Here goodness, somebody once counted them. I can't see all of them, but there are probably 15 or 20 bananaquits all in there swarming this feeder. Similarly here, a variety of hummingbirds coming into this feeder afterwards in great numbers. And an effort was initiated by Birds Caribbean called Operation Feeder Rescue, and a number of members of Wyncote Audubon I know spoke to me about the hurricane, and I believe some donated funds to this effort, and we would like to thank you for it because we believe it was quite successful. The project, Operation Feeder Rescue, involved shipping 4,200 hummingbird feeders to 18 different islands. Also bottles of nectar or sugar water, about 1,800, and 5 tons of birdseed were shipped to these various islands, starting here with Cuba, then into Great Anagua, Turks and Caicos, and then Puerto Rico, and then into the Eastern Caribbean, into all these islands here. And Birds Caribbean worked with their partners to disperse those feeders and get them out to birds as quickly as they could. Here is an example of some of the giveaway events where they gave away the feeders and gave away the bird seed and provided instructions on how to feed wildlife. And it was quite popular. And these were people who, by the way, who some of them had lost their roofs, some of them had no running water, and certainly did not have electricity. So they themselves were hurting, and yet they still had an interest in their bird populations. And there was tremendous interest in this effort and a lot of satisfaction from the locals in their efforts to try and recover these birds. And here, some school children putting up and learning about the sugar water feeders, the hummingbird feeders, and here's some rather happy students before they put out their their feeders. And here's some folks here actually in Dominica setting up some of the feeding stations in the forest there after the hurricanes hit Dominica. So there was tremendous local support for this effort. And we have reason to believe, although we don't have hard statistics, but certainly a lot of incidental observations that this feeding effort helped pull some bird populations through the period with no food or very limited food. Now, the other things that we can do after hurricanes is we can replace their nest sites or cavities. This, of course, is an expensive endeavor and only used for the most endangered species, but it's commonly used with the Puerto Rican parrots. They will put up artificial nest cavities, and the parrots will use those. So there was an effort for that. And many of you may be aware that the red-cockaded woodpecker in the southeastern United States, in the longleaf pine communities, the mature communities, when they lose their cavities, it's quite time-consuming, several years for them to make a cavity in these live pine trees. So the managers there have found ways to make artificial cavities for those red-cockaded woodpeckers to help bring them back. So here you can see an example, not a Caribbean species, but it's the same idea. So you can bring back nests. You can also improve the survival or the reproductive success for threatened species. And this is an example with a Puerto Rican sharp-shinned hawk. Now, this is an endangered species, subspecies of the sharp-shinned hawk. We have in Puerto Rico a resident population of sharp-shinned hawks. It does not breed. It's recognized as a subspecies. It's different from the mainland species in appearance. And it's quite endangered. The population estimates were about 75 birds before the hurricanes went through. Afterwards, the numbers fell to 19 in the wild. So an emergency rescue effort for them was started by groups funded by the Peregrine Fund. Hannah Weaver was the lead investigator involved in this. And what this project involved was they took the eggs out of the nests of sharp-shinned hawks and they incubated them in captivity, raised the young in captivity, and then raised them and then released the young. They hacked them, as the term is known, back into the wild. It's been quite successful. The problem is if you let those eggs sit out there, there are all sorts of predators and parasites that get them, particularly after hurricanes. There's greater risk. So there was a necessity of doing this. Well, obviously, this is quite labor intensive, quite expensive, and you certainly don't want to do it for most species. Let me just go back here. One of the other things that we recommend in the Caribbean is to protect resilient habitats as post-hurricane refugia. That is, habitats that recover quickly. Now, I gave you an example of a habitat that's slow to recover. That is the high elevation montane habitats. Trees grow slowly there, and these species in the montane habitats require lowland habitats as refugia after the passage of these storms, because, of course, the vegetation grows much more quickly, and the resources, the fruits, the seeds, the flowers come back much more quickly down here in the lowlands. Sadly, however, for much of the Caribbean, it's the lowlands that have been developed for agriculture and, of course, now for tourism. So this is a serious issue. But nonetheless, if you want to protect your montane nectivores and frugivores, what you need are refugia in the lowlands in the hurricane zone. And finally, you should encourage resistant and resilient plants. And I go back to those palms. Although the palms will strip the fronds off and they look absolutely horrible, they survive. They have relatively low mortality in these storms. And they put out their fruits, and birds just pile into those palm trees to feed on those fruits, including the parrot and other species. And here are royal palms. In this case, these are ornamentals that are introduced, but nonetheless, birds are still using them. And we do know that in some of the Eastern Caribbean islands that these palms helped to pull the parrots through. Some of the parrots after these storms came into the cities and into the parks and fed on the ornamental palm fruits. So they played an important role after the passage of these storms. And finally, a message you're well aware of: preserve habitat. Birds that are in small habitat patches are really at the greatest risk. These are the ones that are most likely to suffer from hurricane damage. So any efforts to protect the extent of diverse habitats will benefit these birds. So I thank you.
Well, thank you, Joe. That was very interesting. I know I learned quite a bit. I knew the impact of the storm would definitely have an effect on birds, obviously, but I didn't think about the lack of food after. So that was very interesting, and thank you for finishing on a happy note as well, with the successful project of the bird feeders and the nectar being sent down. So that was also very interesting. So yeah, thank you for sharing. Everyone else that was listening, I only saw one question come in so far, so I'll start with that one. That question is, how do birds find shelter during the storm? One would expect many of them would be blown away by the high winds.
Well, certainly many of them are blown away with the high winds. You can think of those seabirds and those other birds that can't easily find shelter. But a lot of land birds will get down on the ground. And we watched from our home at the time in the mountains in Puerto Rico when Hugo came through. We noticed that on the lee side, that is the protected side of our house where there was no wind, the birds were on the ground and they were foraging, feeding on seeds and insects. And as the winds shifted around, that is the protected area of the side of the house, of course, shifted also. And the birds simply moved around to stay in the lee of the storm, that is in the protected area. So we do know a lot of them will go down to the ground. So a lot of birds will do that. And we know the wind speed decreases greatly as you get down to the ground. And I think a lot of shorebirds, surprisingly, manage to survive these storms, even out on relatively exposed salt flats and so on, assuming that there aren't storm surges or flooding. But if they basically get down low, they can survive.
Thank you for answering. I hope that was a good answer to your question. Let's see if we have any others. Yes, very sad that a lot of the parrots were lost. And like I said, finishing on a good note, great reminder to provide sustenance. Obviously, the people in Jamaica, for example, need help after a storm, but so does the wildlife. So it's very important to consider.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was remarkably successful effort, and there was a tremendous amount of enthusiasm on the part of people who had suffered so much. And I think there's a message in that, a very positive message in that. And, these are people who are still struggling. As I said, many of them didn't have electricity, some didn't have water, but nonetheless, they really took an interest in their birds and wanted to try and help them.
Yeah, very good message, especially this day and age. Okay, so if just give it another couple seconds here. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. Otherwise, I think Joseph wouldn't mind answering questions in the future if you want to send them a wind coat, or just send them to one of your connections, and we'll get that question out there and get that answered for you. But if that's everything, I just really like to thank you, Joe, taking the time to do this on a Friday night and presenting your years and years of research and knowledge. It's very inspiring, especially to someone like me who's just starting out in Windcoat. And I'll be going to Hog Island next year if everything goes to plan. So
Great.
Very inspiring for me. So thank you for sharing with us. I don't see any other questions, so I'll finish with saying thank you, everyone, for joining us on this Friday night. And our next program will be Sunday, December 6th at 7:30 p.m. As Lee said in the beginning, this was going to be our winter dinner and gathering. Unfortunately, we can't do that, so we're all going to celebrate online together. And Dr. Amy Weidensaw will be joining us. So you can register for that right now online. Like I said, thank you all for joining us on Friday night. And I'm going to be logging off here. If you have any questions, like I said, send them to Wyncote Audubon Society. Thank you very much, and everyone have a great Friday night.
Thank you.